Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Last week we talked about the cell membrane and the processes that happen there with our diffusion and osmosis lab with the egg membrane. And we're going to focus on the process of photosynthesis this week and next week. And this takes place in the chloroplast of the cell. So we're focusing on some specific processes and in specific organelles of the cell. And then after photosynthesis, we'll dive into cell respiration. So expect a couple weeks on photosynthesis. Today I'm going to go through the overview of the process, where it happens, and we'll look a little bit at the anatomy of a leaf. And next week we'll dive into the biochemistry of the light reactions in the Calvin cycle and do the uh, leaf Chad lab. This week our experiment is going to be a simulation. So I found a simulation for you that I think will work pretty good. Okay, so what's photosynthesis? Where does it come from? Let's start with Greek roots. Photo means light, synthesis means to put together. So as always in science, if you can understand some Greek and Latin root words, you can oftentimes define vocabulary without knowing what they are. So photosynthesis, we're putting together something through the process of light, and that thing we're putting together is sugars here. We're building sugar from inorganic compounds, carbon dioxide and water. And you should remember that sugars are a category of macromolecules known as carbohydrates. And the purpose of having sugar is to produce energy. So ultimately what's happening here is plants are making or producing their own food. A lot of students incorrectly think that the plants sort of eat the sunlight, and that's not the case. The raw materials of carbon dioxide are synthesized into sugars, and then they actually consume the food that they make, which is pretty cool. Imagine if you could create your own food. That'd be something. So why do we have to learn about this stuff? Well, photosynthesis is probably the single most important chemical reaction on planet Earth. Without it, there would be no life. And the reason why it allows life to exist is because it produces an oxygenated environment, atmosphere. Without plants, we would not have oxygen in the atmosphere, and most of the life as we know it would perish. So, besides the fact that it's the single most important chemical reaction, it's also really important to understand photosynthesis from a food and energy context, and we also use plants for fibers and materials. Maybe you're wearing a plant right now. I know I'm wearing a cotton t-shirt, and cotton is indeed a plant, and I'm clothed because of this process right now. Yeah, thanks. Okay, here's our general formula for photosynthesis. We begin with carbon dioxide and water as the raw ingredients, and along with light to catalyze this reaction to energize it, we produce glucose, C6H12O6, oxygen, and also we produce water as a byproduct as well. And so you're going to have to memorize this equation since it's the most important equation on planet Earth. And we already know this molecule, glucose and water and carbon dioxide, so it's just a matter of putting that together. You don't have to memorize the coefficients here for the balanced chemical equation, but definitely know like the reactants are carbon dioxide, water. The products are glucose and oxygen. Now the second equation down here talks about cell respiration. We'll get into that a little bit later, but basically that's when we burn the sugar with oxygen to sort of reverse this chemical reaction and produce carbon dioxide and something called ATP. And you'll learn about ATP this week. It's a really important chemical with respect to energy in animal and plant cells. A good place to start with photosynthesis is understanding a little bit about light and how it works. So light moves in waves, and also carries energy packets called photons. Light has a dual nature to it. It can be described as a particle or it can be described as a wave. And we'll need to use both descriptions to understand photosynthesis because the wavelength of these waves dictates what the leaf can absorb. And the photons are like these little packets that strike the chloroplasts and are absorbed. So the energy that is carried in these photons is inversely proportional to the wavelength of the wave. There's a relationship between the amount of energy that electromagnetic waves carry and their wavelength. And so what we see with light is the visible spectrum. Most of the electromagnetic spectrum is actually invisible to the human eye. And so in this area here, this visible part of the spectrum, there's all sorts of other waves coming from the sun or from other stars. And you're probably familiar with radio waves, which is the wavelength that your cell phones work on. The infrared waves are sort of heat waves. And then UV rays are the waves from the sun that can cause sunburns. And those are actually invisible. So when you get a sunburn, you can't actually see the UV rays that are causing that. X-rays, a lot of you have probably had X-rays before. So all of these are properties of electromagnetic radiation, otherwise known as light. Now, if we zoom into the visible spectrum here, we can see the wavelength of blue light is shorter than the wavelength of red light. And that's going to be important for how plants use this light to create food for themselves. So the energy to power this chemical reaction, it all comes from the sun and primarily from the visible spectrum, as we're going to see here in a moment. So how do plants do it? They absorb the light from the sun by pigments, and you probably have heard of a pigment called chlorophyll. So chlorophyll absorbs the light from the sun, mostly blue and red. And the reason why we see green as the primary leaf color is that's the light that's reflected back. And you can see that in this graph here, how the violet blue wavelengths are absorbed. So this is on my dependent variable here, I have relative absorbance. And also on the red orange end of the spectrum, we're starting to absorb again. But waves in this central area, the green and yellow, are oftentimes reflected and they're not able to be used by the chloroplast to do photosynthesis, which is interesting. You know, a lot of people think that chlorophyll is green and absorbs green light. Actually, it absorbs the other stuff and reflects the green back. So here's a close-up of a plant leaf, and we can see some different things going on here. The wording is pretty small, but you should be able to see this. At the top layer of the leaf tissue, we have something called the upper epidermis, and on top of that is something called the cuticle. So we'll learn the anatomy of the leaf. You know, the cuticle is like this waxy layer that prevents water loss. The upper epidermis are basically the skin cells. So we looked at the upper epidermis of the onion last week when we were examining some plant cells. And as we go deeper into the leaf tissue, we start to see some changes take place. Here we have the mesophyll. We have veins which go into the leaf to transport materials, primarily water. And then deep inside the leaf is where we have all of these chloroplasts here. Lots and lots of chloroplasts. And so the chloroplasts are found in this spongy mesophyll layer. So if we look inside at a plant cell here, the organelle we care about are the chloroplasts in this plant cell. And so inside the chloroplast are going to be all the chemical reactions that happen in photosynthesis. So let's zoom into the chloroplast and take a look at these things called stroma, grana, and thylakoids. So Basically, a thylakoid is a sort of like this pancake shape, and you're reading they talk about how chloroplasts have some similarities to a stack of pancakes. And so what these are basically um, membrane enclosed power plants. And the membrane is really important on the thylakoids because that's where the light reactions actually happen. The stroma is sort of like the cytoplasm. It's this space here. And if we have a bunch of thylakoids stacked together, we call that a grana. So grana is your stack of pancakes, and the thylakoid is this double membrane where the light reactions take place. Here's another picture of a chloroplast. This is maybe a little more realistic. Here's the pancake stack. We called that a grana. Each individual pancake is a thylakoid, and the stroma is sort of the space around these pancake stacks. And so that's really the main thing going on inside of a chloroplast. And the main function of a chloroplast is to do photosynthesis in plant cells. Now, we wouldn't find these in animal cells, right? So here's an overview. What happens here is light comes in into the thylakoids, like we talked about, along with water and carbon dioxide. What we're doing is we're producing this stuff called ATP, which I should probably talk about right now. ATP is essentially the molecule, the energy carrying molecule in cells. So we actually have ATP in our bodies too. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. And so what happens with adenosine triphosphate is we can sort of think of it as being a battery. And that battery can be charged or it can be uncharged. It's charged, we can use that energy. So what we're doing is we're charging the ATP molecule through the light reactions, and that ATP is going to help to power the dark reactions where we actually take the carbon dioxide and build the sugar. So really the point of these light reactions that happens in the thylakoids is to create something called ATP. NADPH is another energy carrying molecule, which is also important, but not quite as important as ATP. So we'll focus on ATP. Now this week we do not have to go into the biochemistry of photosynthesis. We're going to do that next week. So this week really our goal is to sort of understand the overview, where it takes place, a little bit about the structure of a leaf and electromagnetic radiation. And next week we'll dig in and see how this all plays out from a chemistry perspective and hopefully learn some stuff. All right, I think that's a pretty good place to stop.